Jai Ma, Jai Ma. So we'll start. Ma. Om Mangalam Gurudevaya Devya Matriksha Mangalam Mangalam Bhakta Brindebhyo Sarvalokaya Mangalam Om Stapakaya Chidaramasya Sarvadharma Sarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaya Mangalam Om Guru Brahma Guru Vishnu Guru Deva Maheshwara Guru Deva Param Brahman Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Sarashivasamarambam Shankaracharamaध्यamamashmarachaраprayantam Vande Gurum Paramparam Om Bhadrakali Namo Nityam Saraswati Namo Namaha Veda Viranga Vedanta Vijastana Evacha Sri Ganesha Sharad Guru Vyur Mahari Om Jai Guru, Jai Guru, Jai Guru. So continuing our discussion on the Devi Gita from the Srimad Devi Bhagavatam. And let's see where we were last week. I'm going to bring up the verses here. Let me see here. So just reading a few verses behind, just for context. The Divine Mother, Bhuvaneshwari, is speaking to the Devas, headed by Himalaya. And she's now describing how she and only she is the ultimate cause and foundation and cause of this universe, of all universes, of creation, of manifestation, of reality, right? So she's beginning to explain how she creates this universe, how she creates the universe, starting with describing, she does it by the mysterious power of Maya. And in the beginning, she described a very Shakta form of understanding of Maya. And then she describes various definitions of Maya according to the two various schools, saying here, such are the various names found in the Vedic and other sacred texts, the various names of Maya. So many different views of Maya are described. And then she uses the Advaitic, the classical Advaita, what I call classic Advaita, or the Shankaracharya school of Advaita, definitions of Maya, and it's trying to establish that in this instance, this view of Maya, that Maya, the power that creates the universe and the universe that's created out of it, is distinct from her, right? And then she identifies herself with the Brahman of the Upanishads, and then with the move of the Upanishads and of the Advaitic schools of interpretation, with the Atman, the self of all beings, our self, the self equals Brahman, Brahman equals Bhuvaneshwari, Devi herself, right? And using that, what I described as a harsh language of Advaita, of Advaita Vedanta, should I say, describes how everything in Maya itself and everything in Maya is Jada. So we'll go through those verses. It means not conscious, right? And objects of consciousness, never conscious itself. So we spent a lot of time describing the difference between the seer and the seen and those type of analysis that's very common in the school of Vedanta. Such are its various names found in Vedic and other sacred texts. Since Maya is something we can perceive, it has a nature of non-conscious matter. Since knowledge destroys it, it is not truly existent. Consciousness is not something we can perceive. What we perceive is indeed non-conscious. The term here, we'll have to go back to it today. Jada. Jada means inert, right? Dull, right? The opposite. So jada is anything that can be perceived is jada, and the perceiver is consciousness, sometimes described as chaitanya, sometimes as jnana, sometimes as chit or chid, chit actually, and sometimes as what's the other one she uses? Forgetting the term. My favorite term. Sambit. These are the main terms for the perceiver, the perceiver, the knower, the witness, consciousness itself. Conscious is not something we perceive. What we perceive is indeed non-conscious. Consciousness is self-luminous. Nothing else illuminates it. Swaprakasham to Chaitanyam. right? That's a very important idea here. It does not even illuminate itself. In other words, consciousness is never an object of consciousness, for that would lead to the fallacy of infinite regress. We were joking today over tea, kind of the view people, it's almost a parody view now, but if somebody's saying, oh, the world is flat, I mean, you say, well, what is it? What's it on? Well, oh, it's on. I mean, different texts, including ours, say it's on the back of elephants, right? And what are the elephants on? Well, the elephants are on top of a turtle, right? The divine tortoise, right? And what's the tortoise on? A turtle on. So, oh, there's another turtle underneath that. And what's underneath that? Another turtle. So the joke is that it's, I mean, you must have seen memes and things that it's turtles all the way down, right? There's no, an infinite regress is there's no answer. What's, when you're trying to find the foundation of something. So similarly, just simply stating that consciousness illuminates consciousness, that then what illuminates that, what illuminates that, what illuminates that. So the claim here is, or the statement here is that consciousness is it never illuminates itself. As an agent and the object acted upon are distinct entities, so consciousness itself, like a lamp, while shining brightly, illuminates what is other than itself. Know this, O mountain, talking to the Himalaya and the Devas, talking to us. For thus I have demonstrated that consciousness belonging to my nature is eternal. Right, mithyātvādasaṅgatvaṃ sambit. So that consciousness is sambit here. The term, that's an example of the term sambit for consciousness is eternal. Then it uses the hold on here. Yeah. Then he uses the using the examples given in the Upanishads. Of the three states of consciousness, that consciousness not only perceives something as different itself, but also the very states of consciousness are also objects of perception. And the states of consciousness are not steady. And consciousness, part of the definition of real in this sense, is that which is non-changing, that existed in the past, that exists in the present, and will not be, and will exist in the future. Right? That's its definition of the real, or sat, in this rarefied use of the term, the Vedantic use of the term. And so, and the world itself comes and goes in different states of consciousness, right? The visible world appears and disappears constantly in the various states of waking, dream, and deep sleep. Pure consciousness is never experiences such fluctuations. We talked about the three states of consciousness, the fourth state, the turiya, the witness, between the different states. We spent quite a bit of time on that. Even if this consciousness itself became an object of perception, then the witness, the one who observes that consciousness of that perception, would abide as the real pure consciousness as before. This is a reference going back to the infinite regress idea, that in classical law, in Indian classical logic, that an infinite regress, if consciousness is an object of consciousness, that just creates a logical problem. But here it's like, even if you do say that, maybe consciousness is, then the one that's observing consciousness, that is whatever we're calling conscious that you think you can observe, the one that's conscious of that is the self, is a real pure consciousness, not the consciousness that you think you're observing. So it's just going back to not letting that idea go, because we sometimes use a language. I mean, I use that language all the time. Oh, Guruji was a Brahmagyani or a Atmagyani, or he realized the self. He knew the self. He Saddarshan saw the truth. We use that type of language. That we have to be careful. I mean, some would say we have to be careful with that language, that the self can never be an object. And like, he knows a knower. That's a way of saying something, but it may not be. It doesn't mean that the knower is an object of knowledge, right? It's so the next verse, I think, describes that. Those who are versed in religious treatises regarding the real declare the consciousness to be eternal. I also gave a alternate definition. Those who know not just the religious text that describe the nature of the real, right? And I use an example of that, the Bhagavad Gita, that the knows or knowers of truth know that the temporary doesn't, that the difference between the temporary and the eternal by noticing the nature of both. I gave that example as one of these, but it also could be those who know real scriptures, because there's other schools with their own scriptures that would reject this idea that consciousness is eternal, right? And the major schools of Buddhism at the time, philosophical presence of Buddhism would be sometimes seen in this school that deny the eternality of that consciousness is unchanging, right? I think consciousness is also another changing nature, something else changing, and there's no self that's unchanging behind everything, right? And even modern, we mentioned even modern philosophy and psychology, materialistic psychology also would say that consciousness is generated by matter itself, and therefore it's temporary and changing. So that type of school. So rejecting those, because those who know the real scripture, like the Upanishads, right, or the scripture that talk about the truth, about know the difference that they declare that consciousness is eternal, right? Mithyātvādasaṅgatvaṃ proktam sachastre kodina. So that those who know the real scriptures, or the scriptures about the real, know that say that consciousness is eternal, and its nature is bliss ananda rupa, right? For as an object of supreme love. We didn't get much time to speak about this today. Tonight's topic is primarily this thing, that its nature, this consciousness' nature, right, which is eternal, which is never an object, which is always the subject, is nature is bliss, ananda, right? And it says, so now the definition of bliss here is connected with para prema, right? Spandita. So it is a nature, it's bliss because it is the object of supreme love, right? It's also here object of supreme love, the nature of supreme love, the source of supreme love. We'll discuss that a little bit. So this is now today we're starting picking up on verse 18. Let me get my catch up with my notes here. Verse 18. Let's see, I didn't separate, I haven't practiced. Mana bhūvaṃ hi bhūyāsamiti premātmani sthitam. I can't make this, my eyes are very good tonight. I did it too small on my screen. Sarvasyā'nyasya mithyātvādasaṅgatvaṃ sphuṭaṃ mama. Please forgive me, Ma Bhuvaneshwari. Ma bhūvaṃ, bhūvaṃ hi. So this is the feeling. Let me not cease to be. Now it's using an evidence, a symptom of our own experience, right? And claiming that is a symptom of a spirit of the spiritual fact. What's the spiritual fact? That consciousness is eternal, its nature is bliss, and is the object of supreme love. Now the evidence of that is that the feeling, let me not cease to be, let me exist forever, right, is rooted, that is our experience. That's the claim. This is our experience. The feel certainly there is the feeling, let me not cease to be, let me exist forever, is rooted in love for the self. So that feeling that everyone's experienced, claim that this is everyone's core experience, undeniable experience, right, is rooted in the very nature of the self, which love for the self, as the self is the object of love, the source of love, right? Something like this, right? And then it goes back to reestablishing the nature using this hard Vedantic distinction. Certainly there is no actual relations between me and all else, since all else is false. Right? Again, back to that I have no relation with anything, everything else is false. But our experience, let me not cease to be, let me exist, right? That is rooted in love for the self, right? This is our love for the self, right? I'll give a couple other translations just to give different flavors of this, because the Sanskrit is dense and can be pulled apart differently. Swami Satyananda, whose translation we also have, all thoughts give the feeling I am, and never the feeling I am not. So here he's interpreted not like let me exist and let me not cease to be. Now it's just the idea that when you think about anything, it's kind of I think therefore I am. When you think of anything, those thoughts declare I am. there's a thinker, there's an observer of those thoughts, right? So that, I mean, so the very phenomenon of thought says I am and does not say I am not, right? And this also is also a critique, a point for point critique of schools of Buddhism of the time, right? Thought itself presupp presupposes something existing, the I am existence, right? So all thoughts give the feeling I am and never the feeling I am not, right? This feeling exists intrinsically within the soul as love, right? So that's an interesting thing. So the very that feeling of I am comes from that's within us as love. What else do you say? Thus, I am quite distinct from all else, which is false. So again, that second line. Swami Vijnanananda, Sri Ramakrishna's disciple. From the, I also you have the translation. I gave you a PDF on the main page. He says, "Never the jiva or embodied soul feels I am not." Right. So that's another thing. So, but I am. Right. So three different views. One, Mackenzie Brown says, um, um, we have a feeling, let me exist, let me not cease to be, let me live, let me survive, let me exist, let me not cease to be. Swami Satyananda says we have thoughts and feelings, and therefore those say to us, I am, not that a non-existent being would not have feelings and thoughts and ideas, right? So that exists. And Vijnana is saying, his translation, Swami Vijnananda is saying that we feel that we never feel we're not, right? Right. You don't like, oh, I'm just sitting here not existing, right? So it's like we sit around thinking I exist, not I don't exist, right? So I'm compelled. I mean, once again, you could see the thin Sunday of these is dense, right? And so, and my knowledge of the original of the Sanskrit is not. Some of the other verses are clear. This one I'm trusting more or less the translations, although we pulled apart the words best we can. Ma na bhūvaṃ. That means that here don't, na not, bhūvaṃ, I exist. That's a way of saying nobody says I don't exist. Right. So this is lending itself to Vijnanananda's translation, Swami Vijnanananda's translation. Nobody says I don't exist. Right. Of course, this is, like I said, if you look this as a little bit of a dialectic or not dialectic, um, an argument response to schools of Buddhism, right? It's like we're sitting here now thinking, oh, we don't have a self. We sit here thinking we have a self without even being conscious of it. We thinking we have a self, right? So he says, never the embodied the whole feels I am not, but I am. And he says, then this feeling is deeply established in the soul as love. Right. So each one of these gives a different flavor of our experience. We feel we exist. And that feeling of existence, begun on this translation, is situated, is is established in the soul as love. Love itself is the feeling of existence. Our feeling of our own existence, right? Or the fact that we think we exist, or the fact that we don't want to die and want to live, right? Something like that, either three, is rooted out in love. And so here, read love equals ananda. Ananda equals happiness. And we can see this, right? We want happiness, right? And maybe I don't have to convince you that love is innate happiness. The real source of happiness is love, right? And you try to find happiness out of love, right? I mean, these are just simple ABCs of psychological health, right? Or to speak of profound Vedantic statements, right? But the idea that our existence, our feeling of existence, is rooted in love, and love means ananda. Ananda means happiness, right? But once again, anyway, we'll do like that. And then he translates, this is clearly evident that I am quite separate, Thus, it is clearly evident that I am quite separate from anything else, which is all false, right? So he is making that conditional. Because of that, because of this, it's obvious that I'm separate from everything else, right? So it's again, who is she? She is the self, and she's the one. We're the self, and she's the self, right? That's that connection. Um, so let's see. I am. Let me look here. Nana bhūvaṃ he bhū iti. So ma na bhūvaṃ. Nobody says I am not. I'm just pulling apart the words to understand the beauty of the term here. Bhū bhū I am, right? Iti. Now this is everyone says in quotes, right? I am, not I am not, right? And the term is premātmani, right? That term premātmani, you can see it. Where is it here? It's stuck in. Oh yeah, it is. Premātmani sthitam, right? Premātmani is love for the self, right? Love for the self, and then sthitam, rooted, grounded, established, right? It's the feeling I am not, and I am not that I am not, right? Is rooted in love for the self, right? So reading from in the commentary, maybe not maybe in a footnote on these verses. I'm not even sure if it's a footnote of this verse, but I pulled it. Maybe it's a footnote for this verse. In the Mackenzie Brown, I'll read from. She is quoting from the Panchadasi. I mentioned last week that these verses are sometimes direct quotes from the Panchadasi, and sometimes references to ideas developed in the Panchadasi, which is an important text of arguing for and giving examples for the truth of the Advaita Vedanta, Adi Shankaracharya's Advaita Vedantic school, right? Very important, right? This now ever existing this, what is the exist referring to here? Ever existing consciousness is known as self or Atman. He's quoting from the Panchadasi. It is a matter of common experience that everybody manifests his love for self by saying, "May I never cease to be, may I continue to exist always." Right. So Ma in the story in the text, Ma is speaking, is quoting from Panchadasi, right? Or we could see that this to give it the way we would tend to try to embrace the reality that Ma's quoting from a text that's not of ancient, that didn't exist when the when this text when this circle of gods met in the Himalaya thousands of years ago, before Tadakasuta was born, right? Right. We could say that the reality that's being revealed here, right? The scribes who wrote this text are quoting using the language of the Panchadasa. We can say that this already established philosophical treatise, right? So this is the exact same point that Ma's making here is from the Panchadasi. It is a matter of common experience. That's your experience and my experience. That everyone manifests his love for self. Now, in the self, love for the self, we love ourselves. We're supposed to. I mean, maybe a psychological statement, we should love ourselves, right? Maybe it's a statement of psychological health, at some level of psychological health, right? But behind even psychological um, 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 distress, right? And a situation we're not in a healthy situation, behind it is still a love for the self, right? There that we want to deeply, we want to exist, we want to be, and that existence is of the nature of bliss and so a man of his love for himself, saying, "May I never cease to be, may I continue to exist always." Therefore, the self being the object of absolute love, i.e., being beloved for its own sake, is said to be the nature of supreme bliss. So the self being the object of absolute love. Here it says in another verse, actually, I think in a verse will be it actually uses the term padama prema, or the previous verse perhaps. Let me double check here. Yeah, Pada prema, right? It says the object of supreme love. So the term even is supreme love, right? So uh, yeah, the self being the object of absolute love, and then he glosses the definition of absolute love, being beloved for its own sake, right? Not for somebody else, something else's sake, right? It's intrinsic, right? It's said to be the nature of supreme bliss, on Paramananda, right? I use this. This is a very famous. I should have. It's a museum piece. Very famous image of. I believe it's Parvat Yuli in the museum. If you look at Google this piece, it will usually describe it as an image of Ma Parvati. But it's a beautiful. I think it's an ancient piece, right? That you could see. The art piece I chose to illustrate to go along with this verse. I try to, even if we're talking high philosophy and abstract philosophy, we want to keep the focus on the Divine Mother. Ultimately, she's the one, at least she's the one speaking it and revealing aspects of herself, right? But I love this because it's her face is extremely blissful, right? Enjoying her own blissful, loving. It's both blissful, content, self-absorbed, and ecstatic, right? So to me, it's, I'm putting attributes to it, what I get from this picture. So I chose this one for that, right? There's a, let me go out of this real quick here. Uh, um, so the idea that that our love, check here real quick here. Oh, the verse I just quoted, the section from the uh, uh, Panchadasi, this is from 1912 translation, Rao and IR translation. So you can see this text has been around in the English language also, really important foundation even of the Western world understanding of Advaita Vedanta. This text was translated very early on for our English speaking audience. Um, so I have something in my notes. I'll read a paragraph in my a couple sentences of my notes just so I don't lose the point I was trying to, in my mind, I wanted to make. It is the love here. Love equals Ananda, right? Right. That is capital IS, right? The self, right? That self is manifest. It it is the love Ananda that is the self that manifests as love of self, right? So that's our conceptual statement. It is love or bliss that is the self, and that's the self that manifests as love for the self. So love for the self is the symptom of the self that is love. Okay, you can get to stick with that, right? And that is psychologically the evidence of that is the desire to exist and not cease to exist, right? It is also the love, Ananda, that is a self that manifests as love for everything else, right? Because it's love for the self is the nature of the self, right? It doesn't need anything else. It's self-manifest, self-obvious, it's self, it's like it does, like the self doesn't illuminate it illuminates everything. It's simply self-luminous, right? So here it's also self-love, right? It is a symptom is love for the self, right? But it's also the reason we love everything, right? We love other things also because of the self, right? And though this is not a point that's being explicitly brought out in this verse, but these verses are opportunities to expand and riff on some of the themes, right? Appropriate themes, right? And so a very famous from the Briha Aranyaka Upanishad. This is, I can't say it's our favorite Upanishad, but it's supposed to be our favorite Upanishad, our sannyas lineage, the various sannyas lineages, in the Dashnami system, according to the mutt that we descend from, have certain things that we're supposed to be caretakers of. One of which, for us, our Upanishad is the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, right? So it's we're told to be fond of it, and we happen to be very fond of it, right? And it has some great doozies of classical Upanishadic lore and teachings, right? And so there's one where um, uh, Maitreyi she's Swamiji, you remember who the guru, the husband of Maitreya is? I'm forgetting just now.
Yajnavalkya?
Yajnavalkya, right? Yajnavalkya.
Think so.
So Yajnavalkya in the scene, the sage Rishi Yajnavalkya is about to enter the final stage of life, sannyas, and he's about to renounce the world. And he divides. He's about to give his meager property and other things to his wife before he renounces the world. And his wife asks the rishi. She herself is Rishi Patni. She is a wife of a rishi named Gargi, right? It's Gargi, yeah. Not no Maitre. There's a couple Maitre, but she herself is Rishi, because this scene, and based upon this scene, she becomes Rishi Patni, the wife of a rishi, to herself a rishi. She's listed as one of the rishis after. This is part of that impetus, right? And so she asked about, to say, well, no, actually, he says none of these things will bring you happiness. These are all external things, right? Everything in this world is, to use, I mean, I'm inserting the verses from today into the conversation. It's like they're objects. They'll never make you satisfied, right? The things themselves don't make anybody happy. I'll tell you, you have no connection to them. They're unreal, right? To use that language of that Ma's using here, right? And so then she asked, well, teach me what is real. What is the essence? And so this is a long litany, a beautiful litany. I'll read the section because it's just so beautiful. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, book 2, chapter 4, starting from verse 5, I believe. Right? It is not for the sake of the husband, O my beloved, that the husband is dear, but for the sake of the self. That's how it starts. Of course, she's about to lose her husband. He's about to go into the forest, right? But so interesting, it's like, I'm dear to you, not because of me. And then he uses the term, my beloved. I don't know, I don't have the Sanskrit in front of me, but something like my dear, right? Right. In other words, you're dear to me, not because of you either, not because you're my wife, right? Because of the self. And as we can interpret, this chapter, this section, has been interpreted in various ways by different commentators. One way, in the devotional and slightly more dualistic way of interpreting, is because the self means the soul. If, like, for instance, a soulless woman, even though she is your wife, is no longer dear, you get her body and you throw it away, you burn it or bury it, right? A soulless husband, right? So it's like the self without the body, without a self, without a soul, is no longer beloved, right? And that's true. That's everyone's experience, right? But generally, because of the way this text is going to unfold, and then the punchlines at the end, to know the self, know the self, know the self, is not saying because of the jiva, right? It's because of the self, because of the self, not our particular individual soul compared to somebody else's soul that leaves the body. It doesn't matter if the soul's in a body or not. We think something is valuable and dear and beloved because the soul, the self, is beloved. We get happiness and joy and bliss from others, not because of others, not because of souls in somebody else, in that sense, right? Because our self is bliss. Our self is beloved, right? Our self is parama prema, right? And anything we see that we think we're getting happiness from others, from external things, it can't be that, because to go back to our verse, our verse says, I have no contact with anything. In other words, we have no contact with anything, right? She's identifying in these verses, she's identifying as a self, right? And ourself, right? So when she says, I have no connection with anything because it's all unreal, right? That's like, so it's the wife, the husband, the this, the that, all these different things that are going to be listed in the litany, right? We have no real contact with them. But we think we get bliss and happiness from them because we have bliss. We have the self-is nature of love and bliss, of belovedness. I love this connection with bliss, with love, and that's going to be in these verses. The proof of bliss. When we say Satchitananda, God is bliss, or Brahman is bliss, or the self is bliss, that's what's meant. It means love for the self, right? Not selfish love, right? Which is another a step into in the wrong direction of this, right? But love for the self, right? It is not for the sake of the husband, my beloved, that the husband is dear or beloved, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the wife, my beloved. It's like, oh beloved, you're not. It's not because of you that you're beloved. Oh my beloved, right? That the wife is dear, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of children, my beloved, that children are dear, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of wealth, my beloved, that wealth is dear, but for the sake of the self. It is not the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the Brahmins, my beloved, that Brahmins are held in reverence. Like we respect the Brahmins, right? But for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the Kshatriyas, my beloved, that Kshatriyas are held in honor. These are warriors and like leaders, right? But for the sake of the self. It is not for this. It is not for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the higher worlds, my beloved, that higher worlds are desired, but for the sake of the self. Even heaven, the purpose of heaven, the reason we want heaven is because of the bliss of the self, right? It is not for the sake of it is not for the sake of the gods, my beloved, that the gods are worshipped, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of creatures, my beloved, that creatures are prized, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of itself, my beloved, that anything whatsoever is esteemed, but for the sake of the self. The self, Maitre, right, is to be known, right? That self is to be known. Hear about it, reflect upon it, meditate upon it. This is where we get, or this is an example of the Vedantic method of sadhana, where we hear about the truth, we reflect upon it, we meditate upon it, and reflect upon it and meditate upon it. The self, O Maitre, is to be known, hear about it, reflect upon it, meditate upon it. By knowing the self, my beloved, through hearing, through reflection, through meditation, one comes to know all things. Beautiful. I love these verses. There's so much too much to them. And like I said, the commentary can go in many, many ways. One way that some have done it is that when you experience anything happen, you experience any pleasure in this world, right? It's not the thing that gives you the pleasure. The thing or the situation is an occasion for the bliss of the self to shine, right? And so we actually we the pleasure we get from anything and from anybody is not from the thing or the body. Anybody is anybody, right? Or anyone, you could say, right? Any jiva also, right? But for the sake of our own self, the self is nature of bliss. And that bliss is sometimes we get occasions to see it, but there is a psychological principle. These verses are also meant to give us a psychological insight into the nature of our desire. We want pleasure, we want happiness, we want belovedness, we want love from things, but it's not those things. Those things are not the things that we don't want them because of the things, and we don't want the thing, we don't want, yeah, and we don't get them from the things, right? We want them because of the self. We want happiness and pleasure and belovedness because of the self, and we get pleasure from the self, not from those things, right? So it's a anyway, this is profound Upanishadic wisdom. This is the type of realizations that the Upanishads are giving us, or teaching the Upanishads are giving us. Hmm. Let me not cease to be, let me exist forever. That's what this verse says. Let me go back to this. Well, I don't forget the verse here. I have to see it again. Let me not cease to be, let me exist forever. This feeling is rooted in love for the self, right? So we can look at this also. This is the sages of the Upanishads, right? And then the philosophers of and the Advaitic Vedanta tradition, right, have seen this desire for existence, right? See, this verse could be seen as desire for existence or just proof of existence. Our thoughts, we obviously exist, right? Right. But even the desire, not only Mackenzie Brown is choosing the version of this verse that matches the Pancha. I think the reason he's chosen this is because he's connecting it to an obvious Panchadasi verse that's describing the desire to continue to exist forever and never cease to be, not just the fact that we exist and the feeling that we exist and evidence of our existence, right? But the desire to exist, as the evidence for the non-changing and blissful, not only the non-changings, the proof of the self, proof of consciousness, proof of eternal consciousness, and proof, evidence that the consciousness nature is bliss and love, right? So that's the evidence of that. Of course, evolution or biology, we can say something different, right? We can turn that into like a biological and psychological urge of self-preservation, right? Or a survival instinct, right? And that there's an evolutionary reason why we have built in a desire to exist and not exist, and survive. But the maybe, I mean, this particular version of evolution did not exist yet in this version of evolution, should I say, did not exist when these verses were written. But I think even if they were, right, I think the type of sages that would have, and philosophers that wrote this and taught this and realized this, would still say, no, the desire to even the evolutionary need to exist and to continue and to survive itself comes from the fact that the spiritual call of existence, right? Right. And then we think, it's like some do not want to. There may be situations where we don't want to exist forever, right? We have, some people choose not to exist forever, or some people, even people who are sick, and now we have in as part of end of life care, people choose, to when pain gets too much and things like that, and there's more dramatic forms of this also, right? But even that comes from the love for the self, right? Because I mean, I'm not arguing for that. I'm imagining what these sages from this and these philosophers would say to this reality. Like my auntie in the end of her life, she was saying, if I had a chance, maybe there's a way to, it's like all her life she said she believed in the right to at the end of life in sickness. I grew up in in a family that argued for the right to for medical end of life and things like that, right? It didn't come from non-existence. It didn't come from hatred of the self. It came out of the dignity of the self and of her. My aunt would describe it as my own personal dignity, right? It was love for the self, right? Even the seeming, it was not a desire not to exist. It was a desire to exist. It came out of I believe, a desire, or potential, maybe perhaps, right? There's an interesting conception from the love of the self, right? The self, because the self nature of existence is love and bliss, right? And so that even the desire to exist is also the desire to exist in bliss, right? That is we don't just have a nature to want to exist and not cease, right? But we also have a desire to exist in bliss, and the desire to exist and not cease comes, according to this, from love and bliss, right? That it comes from the very nature of the self, which is love and bliss, right? Satchitananda, right? Uh, so I wrote in my notes, trying as I'm thinking about this, the desire to exist and not cease is based upon bliss. Extreme suffering is affront to this inherent bliss of existence, right? And so, anyways, I'm just thinking because there seems to be situations, I can imagine situations where like I I can't exist anymore, right? Or but that is because of the inherent bliss. This is what I'm potentially contemplating. So there's a verse, one of my favorite verses of a non-dual from the non-dual school, from a little known text, I think only recently translated by Swami Atmarupananda, who's now at the French Vedanta Center. As far as I know, my version I have is only from him, so I don't know if there's another translation called Advaita Makaranda, right? And it's a short treatise of very powerful, self-obvious verses on the nature of the self. And so verse 2, I wrote this down. My Sanskrit may be a little off because I didn't, I heard him speak it, and I tried to, one of these, you hear somebody speak and you memorize it and try to write it down. Oh, that's so beautiful, right? So it's as as I remember him speaking it. There may be some mistakes. Aham asmi sadabami kaddachi na amaha priyaha brahmaevaham atasmitam sachitananda lakshamam. Aham asmi. This is our own experience. We don't need philosophy. We don't need the Upanishads to know this, right? Aham asmi. I exist. And this is what the verse is saying. We don't say, I don't exist, right? I exist. The fact of us being able to say I exist is proof. If we even say I don't exist, that's proof of our existence. A non-existent being cannot say I don't exist, right? So that's our experience. Whatever we think we are, whatever and whoever we think we are, whatever and whatever we want to be, right? Or for however long we want to be, to use all the different versions of this, right? We say we know we exist, right? Aham asmi, sada bhami, sada bham, maybe long a, I'm not sure because I heard him say it. Means sada bhami, I always shine, right? That means I'm conscious. This is at the same line. I exist and I'm shining. I'm shining light on things and reality and objects, right? So one thing we know we don't may not we you I mean I don't know if you know yourself or not. My guru used to say, "Know thyself," right? It's a motto of our ashram. Know thyself, and be free. That's the Guruji's. I have the his logo of the ashram, but not the underneath it. It should say in Hindi or in Sanskrit, know thyself, be free, right? So whether or not you know yourself, we know this about ourselves if we think about it, right? I exist and I'm aware, right? You sitting there exist obviously and are aware obviously. And it says Sadash Bami, I'm always shine, I'm always aware, right? And then it says Na Amaha Priyaha. Never am I not dear or beloved, right? These are the three facts that we know about ourselves, right? I exist, I'm shining, I'm conscious, and never am I not beloved. Never am I not dear, right? It's not for the sake of the self, the wife, that the wife is dear, for the sake of the self, right? That dear, I am always dear, right? I'm always beloved, right? So that's a way of saying I exist is sat. I shine. I'm conscious. That is chit, and I'm always dear or never not dear. It's interesting to say I'm beloved and I'm never not beloved, because that's an interesting thing. It's like we may not always. I mean, because I can imagine ways of the way we tangle our minds and thinking about ourselves is something complicated, right? But even if like we don't not conscious of our bliss, we never want we never want not bliss. We never want not to love even if we don't think we love ourselves, we're upset because we don't love ourselves. We don't want to not love ourselves, right? So there's something about that negative language, right? Perhaps, right? I exist, sat, I shine, and therefore I'm conscious, chit, and never am I not beloved or not dear, ananda, love, bliss, right? It says, Brahmaevaham. Therefore, I am Brahma Aivaham. I am only Brahman. Because the definition of Brahman, according to Upanishad, I'm most likely, I don't have verse 1, but I bet you verse 1 establishes Brahman as Satchitananda. Or so some verses in here describe Brahman as Satchitananda. And so I am Satchitananda. You don't need philosophy, just think about it, right? You exist, that's not doubtable. You're conscious, that's not doubtable. And you're beloved, that's also not doubtable. That by definition, that's literally the classic definition of Brahman, or of Atman, of the self, right? Therefore, I am Brahman. I am nothing other than, I am only Brahman. Brahmaevaham. Brahmaevaham. Atasmitam, of the nature of what? Satchitananda Lakshmanan. The nature of Satchitananda, existence, consciousness, and bliss. Right. I remember in one of in the new seminary, one of our retreats, um, um, uh, uh, in New Jersey, Dr. J. Spates, he led a meditation, a visualization meditation called the I Am meditation. It was very interesting, right? Because when we say I am, then we put something after it all the time, right? I am this, I am that, I am a Swami, I am angry, I'm there's all things we can put. I'm Mexican, I'm Republican, I'm, disappointed, I am hurt, I am whatever the who we think we are and what state we are, we put after that I am, right? But the I am, and that was the point of the meditation was to have a realistic thing at the end of the I am, right? What you tried to find out what the proper thing to put at the other end of the I am. And I appreciate it was very powerful and I think effective for the point that was being made in that visualization. But before that, the I am without nothing else after it, right, is I think also really helpful. And therefore, because if you don't put anything after the I am, just I am, not I am this or I am that or I'm in this state, right? I am leads to Brahmaiva, I am Brahman, right? Just the idea I am is evidence that I am, makes you realize I am Brahman. When you think that the fact that we're conscious, not what we're conscious of, is proof that I am Brahman. And the fact that we are beloved by nature, right, is proof that that we're Ananda, that we are Brahman, of the nature of Satchit Ananda. What do we have? So there's this can get, of course, this can get, it's like, but who is the I speaking, right? And of course the I, if the I, Swami Vivekananda made at one point, if you say aham brahmasmi, here it's basically brahmaivaham, I am only Brahman. This is like this is a rewording of a Mahavakya, right? I am only Brahman, right? Or of the Brahman is real, the world's unreal, and the self is only Brahman. It's one of these type of statements, right? Right. So what is the I there, right? If you say, Swami Vivekananda says, if you say I, and you mean this body, and this mind, and this personality, and its likes and dislikes, and its history, right? And that's not Brahman, because all those, go back to Ma's verse, all those are other than herself. These are all objects of consciousness, not consciousness, right? Things like this, right? So when you say that, when you say I am Brahman, you can't mean that I, right? And therefore, Sri Ramakrishna sometimes warned people against this overly Advaitic. That's a strange thing to say, right? Right? Overly bold stance of saying I am Brahman, because we're completely identified with our body and mind, right? He even says we're not even we're dependent on his examples. We're dependent on food. Skip a meal, and your mind gets all bewildered, right? Your conscience gets all bewildered, right? Right. To say that such a weak intellectual, mental, psychological state of weird identity and unstable mind, right? To say I am Brahman, it seems like a far cry. It may be true in a real sense, but it's not it's maybe not a health. He actually even I think he said it's unwholesome in this age. Did he use that term? I believe, right? That term but it's still true. To say I am Brahman is unwholesome because when we say I, we don't mean the infinite, non-dual, eternal, unchanging subject, right? If when you say I, you mean that, then maybe that statement. So, but Brahman is constantly saying I am. So we don't have to say I am Brahman. Brahman is saying I am, right? That's the other side of this, right? When we say I am, we usually mean the limited body and mind, the ego, right? The ego and the mind and its relationship. I mean, earlier you read something I wanted to that kind of I'm trying to figure out how to connect it to, but from the Brahman saying I am Brahman and I am to us and at our present states, right? Saying, but when we say I am, if I say I am this and that, or I have desires and relationships and it's still behind everything. It's we may what comes after the term I am may be a mistake, but the I am is real, right? And you had read something. I was half asleep. It was I was taking a little attempt of a micro nap, and somebody read this verse, and I like, oh, that's. I wanted to hear it again. Maybe you can share it, somebody.
Yeah, this is from M. Hiriana, and in his well-known book from the last century, Outlines of Indian Philosophy.
Those who aren't want a good outline, I mean, by the title, an outline of Indian philosophy, this is one of the best. And even after all these years, I think it's still respected. Yeah, really, really good. He has a one volume and then a several volume version, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is like but this is just like you said, like the book says, it's the outlines, but it's
Yeah.
just such a wonderful distillation of the
Yeah.
various philosophical schools. And so when he's talking about the Upanishads, he brings up this, he kind of talks a little bit about how some of these ideas we've been talking about also tie into um, the Upanishadic ideas of ethics and good and evil. But
Oh,
the,
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
but it keeps coming back to this idea that you were just talking about, this back to this sense of self and how this it's a bit of a paradox that the sense of self, both when we say I and mean this limited self, that's a paradox in that it both separates, that sense separates, but behind that sense of separation is that sense of unity. And so he kind of talks about this here. And so he says on page 73, the basis of Upanishadic ethics is to be found in the conception of evil not as offending against the will of the gods or swerving from sacrificial rectitude, as in the earlier period, but as the result of a metaphysical error, which sees variety alone, where there is also the unity of Brahman. And I didn't read this, but he also has a footnote right there. He says, according to the acosmic ideal, no doubt, both the unity and the diversity are equally unreal. Yet even in that view, evil disappears the moment unity is realized. In other words, there is no difference between the two teachings so far as the problem of ethics is concerned. Evil originates, according to both alike, in the consciousness that diversity alone is true, and it is overcome by the knowledge that unity underlies it, whatever explanation may eventually be given of that unity in diversity itself. So you see how this keeps coming back to that sense of
Yeah.
unity. So he continues, empirical thought, failing to grasp the ultimate reality, distorts it or cuts it up into parts and presents them as distinct from one another. Evil is due on the practical side to this mistaken view of reality as finiteness is on the theoretical side. It is thus contingent and has no place in the absolute rightly understood. This misleading presentation of reality is seen in the case not only of the objective world, but also of the self. It is because each of us regards himself as distinct from others that he strives to guard or aggrandize himself. Quote, when unity is realized and every being becomes our very self, how can there be any delusion or sorrow then? That's a quote from the Isha Upanishad. In other words, all evil is traceable to ahamkara, the I sense, the affirmation of the finite self, and the consequent tendency to live not in harmony with the rest of the world, but in opposition to, or at best, in indifference to it. The impulse behind this ahamkara is not in itself bad and does not need to be wholly suppressed. The instinct, and this is the where this really ties into what we've been talking about, the instinct to live or to strive to be, which is what ahamkara signifies, is a common feature of all animate existence and is only a manifestation of the desire for self-realization. But being really a desire to transcend the finite being it will remain unsatisfied until it is rationalized through a knowledge of the ultimate truth, and the wider self is averred in place of the narrower one. That is the meaning of the aham brahmasmi, which represents the realization of Brahman in one's own self as the highest ideal of life.
So, Swami, do you think that trying to understand it, that behind the ego saying "I am," right? That because the ego, you think ahamkara is the I am, the sense of I am, but that's different than the actual self, right? But it's related.
Well, I guess you could say, in tying it to what you were saying earlier, the ahamkar is the I am fill in the blank.
Yes, yes, yes.
But you can't get the I am fill in the blank without the I am. So the real I is the I am. And so
Mhm.
all the problems in the world, in a certain sense,
Yeah,
come
yeah,
from the I am this or that or
yeah,
fill in whatever. But behind, and that's why it's kind of like it's a simultaneous, you,
yeah,
that's the problem. But the problem within the problem is the solution, you can say.
yeah.
Behind that self, if you can get, like you said, to the just the I amness, that
Hmm.
is aham brahmasmi.
Hmm. Hmm.
Once you've got that, and the very sense of I am this or I am that, or I want this or I want that, and you're standing in the way of this because you're you and I'm me and you're blocking me. All this stems from behind all that is the self, which is, and it's that unitive self. And so I like that line where he says, um, it's a common, you know, the instinct to live and to strive to be. And like you were saying here, that I not cease to be. It's like that wanting to sustain, to
Yeah,
survive, but keep on surviving, is which is what ahamkara signifies. Is a common feature of all inanimate existence, all animate creatures, and is only a manifestation of the desire for self-realization. But, this is why I had underlined in pencil, but being really a desire to transcend the finite being, it will remain unsatisfied until it is rationalized through a knowledge of the ultimate truth, and the wider self is averred in place of the narrower one.
yeah. I'm remembering in last week we quoted some line from or some things from Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi, a great modern sage. Um, in one place he says, like when he tells, if you know about his teachings, they're sometimes described as the path of self-inquiry, right? And so we ask ourselves, like typical, somebody would ask them a complicated theological, philosophical question, and he could answer those questions, but usually he would say something like, "Who's asking that question?"
Mm.
Right? Not like more important than the answer to that question is who's asking that question. And so then I imagine myself sitting in front of him, right? He asked, and I asked him something about Upanishadic, and he's who's asking that question, inquiring to that. So if I were to do that, so I'm asking that. I mean, I'm asking that question, right? So who is the I that's asking that question? So he describes that if one analyzes where the who is the observer, the thinker, the asker, right? Then what comes up is he says something stands up within us
Mm.
that says I, right? But he says that's not the self. The I that stands up when we ask that question is ego, right? He says, but if you analyze it, right, then eventually what happens, that I falls down, right?
Mm.
And then what stands in its place says I. I'm just quoting from the film the this is yeah something I read or from the film Sage Vajrachalam, I don't remember, but it said when that the I falls down, something comes up and says I, right? That's the self, right? That's the self being mentioned in here, right? Not the self that says I'm the one that does it, Swami Bhajanananda or whatever, but so by analyzing, by finding even the Swami Bhajananda aspect of the self, or some Ambikananda like that, and analyzing what's behind that, right? That behind, and I love that this for just being aware that I exist, right? That itself is itself that itself is evidence, is proof, right? And we can rest in that. I mean, it's not that easy because we put something, the I puts a lot of things after it, not just the I am, right? And that's really interesting. But actually, it is now 8:10, 8:11. And so in my enthusiasm, I had three more. I want to finish this section, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to try to be a good boy and try to keep these at roughly an hour so that we don't get, I'm burning myself out with the speaker, burning everybody else out with unnecessarily long philosophical discussions every week. But are there any questions? We'll stop there. Let me go back to our verse so we can look at the verse real quick. The two verses we read today.
Okay, Guruji, one thing you said, or that reminds me of my favorite Emerson poem, and the line where the poem is entitled Brahma, meaning Brahman, and in it Emerson, there's a couplet that's I find very beautiful, where he says, "When they reckon ill who leave me out." So Brahman, the absolute Brahman, is speaking. They reckon ill who leave me out. When me they fly, I am the wings. I am the doubter and the doubt, and I the hymn the Brahman sings. That's one of my favorite lines from him. So that idea, though, that like even those who doubt, they're also a part of the absolute. All of the diversity.
Not only that, it's like I am the doubter and the doubt.
And the doubt itself.
This is a more Shakta perspective, actually. It's both the doubter and the doubt, where Ma here will say, I'm the doubter and never the doubt. The doubt's always an object, which is jada and very distinct from me, right? But you can see, I mean, these verses are being quoted, right? And I the language, her heart's not in it because, right? Because other verses have before and after this will have a more holistic version that she's both the thinker and the thought, not just thinker and never the thought, which is because she's establishing herself as Brahman, which is as unchanging consciousness, and from that she's trying to describe one of the ways how the one can appear as many or become the many. These next verses will show, right? So that she's using this language.
Perhaps she's identifying with all the schools at the same time.
Yep, I think
thereby decreeing the salvific efficacy of all.
Yes, I think that has to be the case.
So I think Rich has.
Okay, let me read this verse and then we'll do the thing. Don't lose it. The feeling, we only talked one verse today. The feeling, let me not cease to be, let me exist forever, is rooted in love for the self. Certainly there is no actual relation between me and all else, since all else is false. So yes, go ahead. Rick, who's calling in?
Is it Rich?
Rich, okay.
Yes, hi there.
Jai Ma.
I was wondering, when it comes to the word bliss and ananda, I've heard the term a lot, but I've never questioned maybe my own biases towards it. So coming more from a Western, Midwest understanding of the word bliss, is there a way to think about bliss in definition? Does it translate equally from bliss to ananda?
Yeah, so nothing translates perfectly, right?
Sure.
In two verses, let me look. Let me see here. I'm gonna jump ahead here. So in the final verse in this little section, not in this chapter, but in verse 21, we haven't got there yet, where it does a therefore, a punchline. Right? I'm going to give you the punchline ahead of time. You have the book, so I'm not revealing too much, right? Therefore, the self, in essence, is consciousness. It's defined as consciousness, and bliss, as well always. But the word for bliss here, it doesn't use the word bliss. It doesn't use the word. It uses sukha. So sukha is a very common word for just happiness, and usually sukha is seen as the opposite of dukkha. Sukha and dukkha. It's misery and happiness. This life is full of happiness and misery. But by using this word, but it's that the nature of the self is consciousness and happiness, right? So even though the term for happiness is a term we understand as something that has an opposite, right? The opposite of happiness is misery or unhappiness, or sadness, like that. So usually we think of ananda not having an opposite. Right, like existence, you could say, oh, non-existence is the opposite of existence, right? We can say like that, right? But we can't think of something as non-existent. Non-existence is not a thing. Only existence is the thing, right? It's like things like that. Or so. Anyways, I've heard it said that Ananda doesn't have an opposite, but in the language, I think that's just a way of saying, trying to show that it's absolute, right? It's when in that litany that Yagyavulkya told Maitreyi, it's not for the sake of the wife that the wife is dear, right? We can change that. It's not for the sake of the wife that not for it's not for the sake of the wife that one seeks and attains happiness or pleasure, right? It's the sake of the self. So that even if we think of bliss and happiness as extreme pleasure, that's when we can describe bliss as extreme pleasure, right? Something beyond normal happiness, normal pleasure. I was blissed out. I mean, it was more than just happy and more than just pleased. And if our experience and pleasure, it's more than normal amounts of pleasure, right? But so even if we use it in the common way as happiness and pleasure, it's extreme, right? When we use the term, and it's recognized as coming from the self, not from external things. So I think that itself liberates when we don't think happiness comes from an object, right? And therefore limiting our understanding in relationship to happiness, right? So my own Guruji used to say that we want infinite happiness, infinite pleasure. We seek it from finite things, right? And therefore, if you seek, and the way his language, I quote, if you've been around me, I quote this because I quote my guru a lot. This is one of the things that he told me a lot, right? And as foundational. If one seeks infinite benefit, infinite value from a finite thing, one is bound to be disappointed and frustrated, right? And so the thing is, like, happiness, you could say bliss, there's term, bliss is God. That's an actual statement from the Upanishads, right? Bliss is God, or bliss is Brahman, bliss is like that, right? It says, therefore seek bliss. Right, but these would be good. Maybe next week I'll look up, remind myself these verses. It says they're the beautiful verses. It says that bliss, that we want bliss, and bliss is found in the infinite. Right, it's like real happy. We want happiness, but bliss is only found in happiness is actually only found in the infinite. And therefore it says, therefore seek happiness, seek bliss, seek pleasure, seek the infinite. This is the call of the Upanishads, right? Like, we're after it and we get something, but we're not satisfied. No amount of happiness satisfies us, right? I mean, we took a few stabs at Buddhism, but Buddhism by the numbers is I think helps here, right? That everything and any object of happiness that we get, it's imperfect, it's limited, right? There's fear of losing it, and we will lose it. On top of that, not even fear of losing it, we will even, like, imagine, oh, it's perfect. I have the perfect situation, the perfect spouse, the perfect job, whatever it is, a perfect chocolate, whatever it is, right? Eventually, it's not that. I mean, it's like I sometimes think of like a piece of like good food, right? I appreciate wholesome, nicely made food, right? I'm not exactly a foodie, but we eat nice food. We try to eat nice, simple food, right? So if it's a tiny bit too salty, we don't get happiness, pleasure. If it's not salty enough, we don't get happiness. If it's not spicy enough, we don't get happiness. If it's too spicy, you don't get happiness. So maybe it's perfect spiciness, perfect salt, perfect temperature, right? Perfect ingredients, perfect texture. Even though you can see there's such limitation to the nature of happiness and pleasure from food, right? It exists on the tongue for a second, then it's gone. It's temporary, right? Even if we have a perfect spouse and relationship or job, one of you is going to die. One of us is going to die first, right? And the job will not. I mean, a perfect health, even if it's never perfect. No spouse is perfect. No job is perfect. No, like, but even if it's really good, it's also we wrecked with fear and anxiety of losing it, and the fact is we will lose it, right? It's stamped by temporariness, not by infinitude, not by the infinite, right? So bliss is all happiness, all pleasure comes from the self, but because we're seeking it in things that aren't the self, that aren't infinite, they lead to frustration and unhappiness. That Buddhism says. I think that's also, we don't need Buddhism to say that. We don't need that's our experience, right? So that term, maybe in this very Upanishad, I'm not going to remember, that says that bliss is found in happiness, and bliss is found in the infinite. There is no bliss in the finite, therefore seek the infinite. That's the call, the Upanishadic call to spiritual practice and spirituality, to seek pleasure and happiness and satisfaction and value in the infinite, right? Because that's, even when we find it in the finite, it is finite and not satisfying. So our Guruji says we actually we don't just want happiness, we want infinite happiness. We don't just want, we want infinite value, right? We want unchanging value, right? Of course, we also need finite happiness. We need the normal pleasures of life, and we get those in the normal things of life, right? We need normal good things to eat. We get those, but they pass. We shouldn't expect permanent happiness, infinite happiness, or unchanging happiness from temporary, limited, changing things, right? That's only found in the infinite, and the infinite actually in the final the verse in this little section says, "I am the infinite," right? I am the self. I am the infinite, the real, the complete, the full, beyond all relationship, free from all duality. I mean, she makes these big statements. It's similar to the Upanishad saying, "Find it in the self." So I think bliss is described as really extreme happiness. I'm blissed out, or overwhelming happiness or overwhelming pleasure, but that's in our language, and that's the way mystics use when they experience the bliss of something more than finite. They get overwhelmed and discombobulated. They get become mad sometimes. Overwhelmed, faint, swoon, and ecstasy. This type of mystical states, right? But I think it's a recognition that it's the nature of the self, that when a mystic or a saint has an ecstatic, blissful experience, it's because of the self. They're seeking it in the self. And when normal people get blissful experiences from temporary objects, in bodies and food and experiences and political moments and whatever, we get extreme happiness like that, it's also because of the self, but it will not be satisfying, right? So like you can experience extreme pleasure, and I hope and I pray that all of you have experienced extreme pleasure, right? But it doesn't make you a saint, right? The experience of the self, the bliss of the self, it makes one. I mean, my Guruji used the language: before the experience, I was a fool. After the experience, I am wise. There is a transformative thing that, even though it's still described as happiness and pleasure, right? It's where it's experienced, right? I think is important, right? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. And real quick, what was the author of the Outline of Indian Philosophy?
Swamiji, the name of the author?
M. Hirayana.
Hirayana, yeah.
Thank you. Jai
Yeah, Any other questions or comments?
Krishna Chaitra.
Krishna Chaitra.
Jai Ma, Guruji, and Swamiji. Thank you very much for the wonderful class. And yeah, just a kind of a follow-up question to the entirety of the discussion. Or Swamiji mentioned the salvific nature of that verse, and was wondering in regards to last week's answer that you can't buy God with any amount of japa, like you can't buy God with eggplant, or something along those lines was the analogy. And so my question is, in order to get that transformative experience of your Guru Maharaj, that transformative experience of the extreme happiness, but with wisdom, it seems like we can't really generate enough Shakti ourselves to do that on our own without the mercy. So, we're for the Shakti tradition, Sri Ramakrishna tradition, how can we balance that? Find balance that we're trying to do sadhana, but at the same time not trying to buy ma with japa, and at the same
Yeah.
time hope for that salvific, transformative, kripa siddha effect from our or Sri Ramakrishna to get us there. And lastly, if we were to get to that stage, is it possible for us more common man to experience it in this lifetime, or does that can only occur after we leave the body? Thank you.
Yeah, these are all very good questions. So spiritual practice, what in that the happiness exists in the infinite. There's no happiness in the finite. Therefore, if you want happiness, seek the infinite, right? That statement. So sadhana is seeking the infinite, right? That our spiritual aspiration, our goal, our hunger, our desire is for the infinite, right? Or I like this language, infinite. I mentioned last week that my Guru Bhai, Swami Bhajanananda, as a mountaineer, he uses the term the beyond, right? Another word of saying the infinite, right? His Holiness Swami Chidananda, one of our great teachers, he always says the divine, right? Long for the divine, long for divine experience, right? A divine experience, an experience of the divine, or a connection. So that longing leads us. That the longing is the most important thing, right? And because the longing would impel us for sadhana, right? Without longing, we would not engage in spiritual practice. But spiritual practice also by purifying, we mentioned last week, purifies the mind and heart. Manashuddhi is the effect of spiritual practice, right? And for the purified mind and heart, then longing awakens, right? Out of longing, and some spiritual interest and spiritual desire for God, desire for Godization, desire for God experience, right? Desire for happiness. Actually, even it's a desire for happiness, right? Desire in the infinite. Leads us to spiritual practice. Spiritual practice purifies the mind and heart, manashuddhi, and devotion is natural. From the devotional school, I'm coming from we're both coming from profound devotional schools, right? That hold that love of God, longing for the infinite is our very nature. In this language is love for the self, right? In devotional language, in theistic language, is love for God, right? Love for God and love for the self. Here, God, the goddess of the devotional tradition, is saying, "I'm the self," right? Connecting these two schools of thought, right? Is saying that they're claiming that they're saying the same thing, right? Those who love God and those who love the self, right? This is the same action, right? So we do spiritual practice in order to, what is it? To seek God in the infinite. Spiritual practice is seeking God in the infinite. Think of the infinite, right? Inquire and meditate upon, right? In the devotion, we call out her name or their name. There's different precedents of meditation, of study, of chanting, of singing, of worship, of prayer, or other methods of self-inquiry, according to different paths, right? And it always is an act of grace because the I, the ego, it says I'm chanting, right? That's not the I. That's not the I that says I am, right? The one that says I am chanting is not the I am, right? So the ego can never get it. The finite self can never attain the infinite, right? But the infinite in the language of devotion, and you mentioned is kripa, right? It's always an act of grace, right? And so in the theist traditions that we ask for the grace of the Guru, the grace of the saints, the grace of the deities, and the grace of God, of the Supreme Lord, right? And even in the traditions that are more meditative or more jnana oriented, they usually also say that it's the grace of God that gives it, right? And even if there's no God, right? And even most of the traditions hold that there's God, right? Although the understanding may be a little different. But even if there's no God, it's still the grace of the self. It's an act of grace, illumination, right? And so Jesus says, "Knock on the door and it shall be opened," right? Spiritual life and sadhana is knocking, right? And if you seek bliss from the infinite, and we get bliss from the infinite, the infinite has graced us, to use that language with bliss. So yeah, how sadhana, the calling out and the spiritual practices comes from longing. It leads to longing, and longing gets a response, right? Yeah. Hopefully that's helpful. Thank you. Anybody else? It is 8:31, so I think now is a good time. So we thank you for your kind attention. A few reminders: next week, next Saturday, we have Hanuman Jayanti. We'll have some, I think, starting a little earlier, probably 4 o'clock or something. I think we'll have chanting Hanuman Chalisa and go into the evening Arati here. Please come if you can. Also, the retreat is coming up the first week. The in-person retreat coming up the first weekend of next month, Saturday and Sunday. Our theme is Nada Yoga, the spiritual traditions of I have a title for it, divine sacred music, sound, and mantras in the devotional ritual traditions of Hinduism, I think is my subtitle, right? And I've been working today, one of the things while simultaneously preparing for this class, we're also getting the schedule down. I'll probably send it out. I need to be checked with our speakers. I don't want to make sure the timing works for everybody. But it will probably be sent out tomorrow. The schedule, and it will go from morning till evening. Pretty much from the morning puja to the evening arati. We'll have lunch and dinner will be served on both days. And so it's a limited group. I'm thinking of it to be a small group, only to our seminary students. I'm trying to imagine right now what our maximum would be for a intimate thing rather than just like a mass program with hundreds of people. I think if we announce it to the larger group, we can get many more people. But my goal, my original imagining of the seminary retreats is small groups of our seminary students, right? So I'm thinking we'll probably end up with about 20 people, something like that. I think more than that we wouldn't be able to sit around the dooney and things. I would have to rearrange stuff. So we're around that number now. If you want to attend, please let Aparna know. We'd love to have you. We still have a few spaces. Yeah, so that'd be fun. It's going to be, I'm getting, as I'm seeing, going through the notes and organizing it, I'm really feeling that it's going to be a really beautiful immersion in study and sacred music and chanting, and we'll have a fire ceremony it's all the Bhagalamukhi Jayanti. So we'll have a fire ceremony for Bhagalamukhi as part of it. That'd be exciting, I think. All right, thank you for your kind attention. We'll see you hopefully Saturday if you're around this Saturday, if not next Wednesday for another class. Jai Ma, Jai Ma, Jai Ma. Hari Om, we have you. Jai Ma, Jai Ma, Jai Ma. Jai Ma.
Jai Ma.
Jai Ma, Jai Ma. Sundari, Jai Ma.
Jai Ma.
Jai Ma, Jai Ma. Happy to have seen you. All right. Sitaram. I'm back in my room. The last few weeks I was in the library and in the guest room because of painting and things like that. So we're back in this room with our beautiful Ma right there.